In the Arctic waters of the Barents Sea, a quiet cook was about to face her past. What started as preparing morning coffee for a NATO research crew took a shocking turn when they came face to face with a reactor crisis that would expose everything she'd hidden. Elena Mirov wasn't your typical galley worker. For 15 years, she had spent her life designing cutting-edge submarine systems for the Russian Navy, known for her brilliant engineering mind and classified expertise that could save or destroy lives. When she encountered failing cooling systems aboard the RV Svalbard, she had no idea the crew would start recognizing the precision in her technical sketches and the authority in her voice when discussing nuclear reactors. Elena's decision to break her decade-long silence would lead to a choice between maintaining her carefully constructed civilian identity or revealing the classified knowledge that could prevent catastrophic failure. What began as anonymous service in a ship's galley would become a moment of truth in the frozen Arctic. The Svalbard and her crew would never be the same after discovering that their humble cook was actually Dr. Elena Mirov, a brilliant defector whose hidden expertise was the only thing standing between them and death in the ice. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The RV Svalbard cut through the Barents Sea like a blade through black silk, her reinforced hull grinding against ice floes that caught the pale Arctic light and scattered it in crystalline fragments. At 0600 hours, the research vessel was already 3 days into what NATO classified as a climate monitoring expedition, though the locked compartments below deck and the unusual collection of specialists aboard suggested objectives that went deeper than measuring water temperatures. Elena Mirov stood in the galley, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she prepared the morning meal for 23 souls. The coffee percolated with a steady rhythm that had become the ship's heartbeat, while bacon sizzled in industrial pans that had fed countless crews across countless voyages. At 47 years old, Elena possessed the kind of quiet competence that made her invisible to most, just another civilian contractor keeping the machinery of military operations running smoothly. Her movements were precise, economical, betraying years of working in confined spaces where every gesture mattered. She seasoned eggs with the same methodical attention she gave to everything else, her dark eyes occasionally flicking to the porthole where endless ice stretched toward a horizon that seemed to exist only in theory. Morning briefing in the wardroom, all department heads. Captain Henrik Volkov's voice crackled through the ship's intercom system, carrying the weight of command and something else, a tension that experienced sailors learned to recognize like the smell of an approaching storm. Elena didn't pause in her work. Department heads meant officers, scientists, senior enlisted personnel. It didn't mean the cook, regardless of what she might know about the vessel's true capabilities or the delicate systems humming beneath her feet. Dr. Amira Kane appeared in the galley doorway, her climatologist credentials marking her as one of the expedition's official purposes. She was young for her position, perhaps 35, with the kind of analytical intelligence that made her notice details others missed. "That coffee smells like salvation," Dr. Kane said, accepting the steaming mug Elena offered with a grateful nod. "I've been up since 0400 reviewing the seismic data." "Anything interesting?" Elena asked, her English carrying just the faintest trace of an accent that might have been Eastern European or might have been the product of too many years working international waters. Dr. Kane studied her over the rim of her mug. There was something about Elena that didn't quite fit the profile of a typical civilian contractor. Her questions were too specific, her observations too technically precise. "The seafloor activity is more complex than we expected, almost like there are structures down there that shouldn't exist in nature." Elena's hand stilled for just a moment, so briefly that anyone else would have missed it, but Dr. Kane was trained to notice anomalies. "Ice does strange things to sound," she said carefully. "Echoes can be misleading." True enough. Dr. Kane lingered, sensing there was more to the conversation. "You seem to know quite a bit about sonar interpretation for someone in food service." Before Elena could respond, Midshipman Rena D'Souza bounded into the galley with the enthusiasm that marked her as new to naval service. At 22, she was eager to please, curious about everything, and hadn't yet learned the military art of selective blindness. "Morning, Elena. The usual chaos brewing?" Rena's smile was genuine, the kind that made Elena remember why she had chosen to work with younger crews. There was something maternal in how she looked after the ship's newest members, though she had never spoken of having children. "Only the good kind," Elena replied, sliding a plate toward Rena. "Extra protein today. You'll need it if this weather keeps building." Rena accepted the breakfast with the gratitude of someone who hadn't yet tired of military cuisine. As she ate, her eyes wandered to a notebook Elena kept beside the coffee station, filled with what looked like technical sketches and notes in what appeared to be Cyrillic characters.
"Those drawings are intricate," Rena observed. "What are they?" Elena glanced at the notebook, then quickly closed it. "Just recipes, family dishes. I write in Russian sometimes. Habit from childhood." But Rena had seen enough to know the sketches weren't recipes. They looked like piping systems, complex mechanical drawings that belonged in an engineering manual rather than a kitchen notebook. She filed the observation away with the curiosity of someone who was still learning to read between the lines of military life. The wardroom briefing proceeded with the structured efficiency that marked professional naval operations. Captain Volkov, his weathered face bearing the marks of someone who'd learned command through experience rather than just education, stood before a digital display showing their current position and projected course. "Seismic monitoring continues to show irregular patterns," he announced to the assembled department heads. "Dr. Kane, your assessment." Dr. Kane activated her tablet, projecting sonar readings that painted an awe-inspiring picture of the seafloor in false colors. "The activity is concentrated along what appears to be a geological fault line, but the patterns are too regular for natural seismic events. It's almost as if something man-made is influencing the readings." Lieutenant Commander Blake Stanton, the ship's first officer, leaned forward with the skepticism that defined his approach to anything that didn't fit standard operational parameters. At 38, he was career Navy, someone who believed in chain of command, proper procedures, and the inherent superiority of military training over civilian expertise. "Could be ice pressure affecting the sensors," Stanton suggested. "Civilian equipment isn't always designed for these conditions." Dr. Kane bristled slightly. "The equipment is specifically rated for Arctic operations, Commander. The anomalies are consistent with metallic structures on the sea floor, possibly abandoned installations or—" She paused, aware of the classified nature of some possibilities. "Other research activities." Captain Volkov exchanged a meaningful glance with Stanton. The expedition's classified objectives included monitoring potential submarine activity in the region, particularly given recent tensions with certain Baltic nations whose allegiances remain questionable. "Continue monitoring. Any significant changes in the readings I want to know immediately." Chief Petty Officer Luis Ortega, 22 years of naval service etched in the permanent lines around his eyes, studied the engineering reports on his tablet. The ship's power systems were running within normal parameters, but he'd learned to distrust normal when it came to the Svalbard's aging infrastructure. Too many temporary fixes held together with marine epoxy and stubborn determination. "Backup power systems are showing minor fluctuations. Nothing critical, but worth monitoring. The reactor's been running hot since we hit the pack ice." "How hot?" Stanton demanded. "Within acceptable ranges, but closer to the upper limits than I'd prefer. These old systems don't like the constant vibration from ice impacts." Ensign Tarek Al-Masri, the communications specialist, looked up from his own tablet with the kind of nervous energy that came from noticing problems others missed. At 24, he was the ship's expert on electronic systems, though his tendency toward obsessive analysis sometimes made his superiors impatient. "I've been tracking some irregularities in our communication array," he said hesitantly. "Nothing that affects current operations, but there are gaps in the transmission logs that don't align with scheduled maintenance windows." "Atmospheric interference," Stanton said dismissively. "Arctic conditions play hell with electronics. Stick to the standard maintenance protocols and stop looking for problems that don't exist." Al-Masri nodded, but didn't look convinced. He'd spent too many hours studying the ship's systems to dismiss anomalies as mere atmospheric interference. The patterns he was seeing suggested something more systematic, more intentional. As the briefing concluded, the department heads dispersed to their various responsibilities. None of them noticed Elena Mirov passing through the corridor outside the wardroom, or the way she slowed her pace when certain technical details were discussed. Her expression remained neutral, professional, but her hands had clenched slightly when Ortega mentioned the reactor running hot. Back in the galley, Elena continued her preparations for the day's meals while processing what she'd overheard. The backup reactor wasn't just running hot. If her memory of the system's specifications was correct, the fluctuations Ortega described suggested a cooling loop that was beginning to fail under stress. The Svalbard carried an older generation reactor, one she was intimately familiar with from her previous life. Dr. Kane returned to the galley an hour later, ostensibly for more coffee, but clearly seeking another conversation. She found Elena studying what looked like mechanical diagrams spread across the prep counter, definitely not recipes. "Those are interesting culinary techniques," Dr. Kane observed dryly. Elena looked up, meeting her eyes directly. For just a moment, her carefully maintained mask slipped, revealing something deeper: intelligence, experience, and perhaps a burden that civilian contractors weren't supposed to carry. Sometimes the best solutions come from understanding how systems really work, not just how they're supposed to work according to the manual.
That sounds like the voice of experience. Personal experience. Elena began folding the papers, her movements careful and deliberate. "I've worked on many ships, Dr. Kane. You learn things." "Not from cooking, though. Those diagrams show submarine-class power systems, very specific submarine-class power systems." The silence stretched between them, filled with the constant background hum of the ship's machinery. Elena finished clearing the counter, her expression returning to its usual professional neutrality. "I make good coffee and better meals, Doctor. That's why I'm here." But Dr. Kane had seen enough to know that wasn't the complete truth. As she left the galley, she carried with her the growing certainty that Elena Mirov was far more than she appeared, and that in the unforgiving environment of the Arctic Ocean, that hidden knowledge might prove to be either their salvation or their undoing. The day progressed with the routine efficiency that marked life aboard a research vessel. Scientific equipment gathered data, crew members maintained systems, and Elena continued to feed them all with the quiet competence that made her essential and invisible in equal measure. But as the Svalbard pushed deeper into the Arctic-locked waters of the Barents Sea, the signs of trouble were building like pressure beneath the surface. Sonar readings that didn't match natural phenomena, communication gaps that suggested more than atmospheric interference, and deep in the ship's belly, a reactor system that was beginning to show the strain of operating in conditions it was never designed to handle. None of the officers noticed these patterns converging, but Elena did, and the knowledge sat heavy in her chest like a stone. The storm arrived without ceremony, creeping across the Arctic horizon like a gray shroud that swallowed the boundary between sea and sky. By 1400 hours, the Svalbard was bucking against swells that sent ice fragments scraping along her reinforced hull with sounds like nail files on steel. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees in 2 hours, and the wind carried the particular bite that meant serious weather was coming. Elena braced herself against the galley counter as the ship rolled through another swell, her practiced hands continuing to prepare the evening meal despite the increasingly violent motion. She'd worked through worse storms, on vessels less stable than the Svalbard, but something about this weather felt different, more purposeful, as if the Arctic itself was testing their resolve. The intercom crackled with Captain Volkov's voice, steady despite the circumstances. "All hands, this is the captain. We're experiencing deteriorating weather conditions and will be adjusting our course to minimize impact. Secure all loose equipment and maintain standard storm protocols." Standard protocols meant battened hatches, secured equipment, and crew members moving with the careful efficiency of people who understood that carelessness in these waters could be fatal. But Elena's attention wasn't on storm protocols. It was on the subtle changes in the ship's electrical systems that others were too distracted to notice. The lights had been flickering intermittently, brief interruptions that might have been attributed to the ship's motion through rough seas. But Elena knew the difference between normal power fluctuations and something more systematic. The pattern was too regular, too specific to the backup reactor's cycling behavior. Chief Petty Officer Ortega appeared in the galley doorway, his weathered face bearing the stress lines that came from keeping aging equipment operational under increasingly difficult conditions. At 52, he learned to read the ship's moods like an old married couple reads their partner's sighs. "Coffee still hot?" he asked, but his tone suggested more serious concerns than caffeine. "Always," Elena replied, pouring him a mug without being asked. "Rough day in engineering?" Ortega accepted the coffee gratefully, using the warmth to thaw fingers that had been working on cold metal for too many hours. "The backup systems are acting up. Nothing critical yet, but the power fluctuations are getting more frequent. Started right after we hit this weather." Elena's hand tightened almost imperceptibly around the coffee pot. "What kind of fluctuations?" "Irregular cycling in the coolant pumps, temperature spikes in the secondary loop. Could be stress from the ship's motion, but—" He trailed off, studying her face with the curiosity of someone who'd learned to value practical knowledge over formal credentials. "But," Elena prompted. "But you get a feeling, you know? 22 years keeping these systems running, you'd develop instincts. Something's not right with the reactor core. The readings are within acceptable parameters, but barely. And the pattern—" He shook his head. "I've seen this pattern before on older Russian-built systems when the cooling loops start to fail under pressure." Elena's hand tightened almost imperceptibly around the coffee pot. "Russian systems?" "Yeah, the Svalbard's backup reactor is a modified version of a Soviet-era design. NATO bought a bunch of them surplus in the 90s, upgraded the safety systems, and installed them in research vessels. They're reliable as hell, but they have their quirks. This particular model was designed for submarine use originally." "Stanton thinks I'm being paranoid. Says it's normal stress response to heavy weather. But I've run these systems through worse storms without seeing this kind of cycling behavior." Ortega drained his coffee and set the mug down with perhaps more force than necessary. "Problem is, I don't understand the engineering well enough to argue with him. The technical manuals are pretty basic, and half the documentation is in Russian anyway." Elena turned away to hide her expression, busying herself with cleaning equipment that didn't need cleaning. "Maybe Dr. Kane could help. She seems to understand technical systems." "Already tried. She's a climatologist, not a nuclear engineer. Smart as hell, but this isn't her field." Ortega paused, then added with the kind of casual observation that could change everything. "Funny thing, though, she mentioned that you seem to know more about mechanical systems than most food service personnel." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the ship's groaning protests against the increasingly violent seas. Elena continued her unnecessary cleaning, aware that Ortega was studying her with the analytical attention of someone who'd learned to value competence over credentials. "I've worked on a lot of ships. You pick things up." "Yeah, I bet you do." Ortega's tone was neutral, but Elena could hear the questions he wasn't asking. Well, if you ever feel like sharing any insights about cooling system maintenance, I'd be grateful for the conversation. Unofficially, of course. After Ortega left, Elena stood alone in the galley, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the counter. The moral calculus was simple in theory, impossible in practice. She'd taken an oath when NATO granted her asylum, never to work on military systems again, never to use her specialized knowledge in any capacity that might compromise her protected status. The alternative had been extradition back to Russia and almost certain execution for treason. But if the cooling system was beginning to fail under stress, and if no one aboard understood the system's design well enough to prevent catastrophic failure, then her silence might condemn 23 people to death in the middle of the Arctic Ocean. Dr. Kane found her there an hour later, staring out the porthole at seas that had turned the color of hammered pewter. The storm was intensifying, and ice fragments were beginning to accumulate against the ship's superstructure in ways that suggested they might be trapped for longer than originally anticipated. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Rough weather?" Dr. Kane observed, accepting another cup of coffee. "It'll get worse before it gets better. This kind of storm can last for days." "You sound like someone who's experienced Arctic weather before." Elena met her eyes directly. "I've worked these waters. Different ships, different circumstances, but the ice doesn't care about politics or flags of convenience." Dr. Kane settled into the small chair beside the prep counter, her attention focused entirely on Elena. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, about understanding how systems really work versus how they're supposed to work according to manuals. Dr. Kane, I'm not just irregular, they're familiar. I've seen similar patterns in declassified reports from submarine detection systems, the kind of signatures you get from reactor cooling loops that are operating under stress." Elena's coffee mug was steady, but Dr. Kane was trained to notice micro-expressions, the tiny tells that revealed when someone was processing unexpected information. "I'm not sure what you're suggesting," she said carefully. "I'm suggesting that you know exactly what I'm talking about. I'm also suggesting that Chief Ortega's concerns about the backup reactor aren't paranoia. They're the observations of an experienced engineer who doesn't have enough technical background to interpret what he's seeing." The ship rolled through another large swell, and something in the galley equipment made a sound it hadn't made before, a slight grinding that suggested mechanical stress beyond normal parameters. Elena's attention immediately focused on the sound, her body language shifting in a way that revealed professional interest rather than casual concern. "The ship's systems are responding to the storm. That's normal." "Yes, but you recognize that specific sound. You identified it as mechanical stress before you consciously processed what you were hearing. That's not normal for someone in food services." Elena stood and began preparing ingredients for the evening meal, her movements efficient despite the ship's increasingly violent motion. But Dr. Kane noticed that her knife work remained precise even when the deck rolled at 30-degree angles, the kind of adaptation that came from years of working in unstable environments. "Dr. Kane, I appreciate your curiosity, but I have meals to prepare and a schedule to maintain. Whatever theories you're developing about my background—" "Elena," Dr. Kane's voice was gentle but firm, "I don't care about your past or why you're here under circumstances that don't quite add up. But I do care about keeping 23 people alive if this storm traps us for an extended period. And I'm beginning to suspect that you might be the only person aboard who actually understands how to prevent the backup reactor from failing under stress." The knife in Elena's hand stopped moving. For a long moment, she stood frozen, processing the weight of what Dr. Kane was suggesting. Then she set down the knife and turned to face her directly. "What makes you think I know anything about reactor systems?" "Because when Chief Ortega described the cooling loop anomalies, your pupils dilated and your breathing changed. Because you've been sketching mechanical diagrams that show intimate familiarity with submarine-class power systems. Because you ask questions about seismic readings that reveal knowledge of sonar interpretation that goes far beyond casual interest." Elena leaned against the counter, suddenly looking older than her 47 years. "Dr. Kane, there are things about people's backgrounds that are classified for good reasons. Sometimes knowledge comes with obligations that can't be discharged without compromising other commitments. What if those other commitments become irrelevant if we don't survive the next few days?" Before Elena could respond, the lights flickered again, this time staying off for nearly 3 seconds before the emergency systems kicked in. When the main power returned, it was accompanied by a subtle change in the ship's engine noise that both women recognized as significant. Dr. Kane activated her tablet and pulled up the ship's power monitoring systems, data that her scientific credentials allowed her to access. The readings showed power fluctuations that were becoming more frequent and more severe. "Elena, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to give me an honest answer. Do you understand what's happening to the reactor systems?" Elena studied the data on the tablet, her expression growing more concerned as she processed the patterns. After a long moment, she nodded slowly. "Yes, I understand exactly what's happening. And if we can't stabilize the cooling loops within the next 48 hours, this ship is going to face a cascade failure that will leave us without power in the middle of an Arctic storm. Can you prevent that?" Elena's laugh was bitter, carrying years of suppressed knowledge and impossible choices. "Dr. Kane, preventing that failure would require me to violate every condition of my protected status and reveal technical knowledge that I swore I would never use again. It would mean admitting to capabilities that could result in my immediate arrest and deportation. And if you don't?" Elena looked out the porthole at the storm that was steadily worsening, at the ice that was beginning to lock the Svalbard into position far from any possible rescue. "If I don't, 23 people are going to die, because I was too afraid to break a promise that suddenly seems less important than human lives." The two women stood in silence, listening to the ship's systems cycling through their increasingly erratic patterns, while the storm built around them with the implacable force of Arctic weather that acknowledged no human schedules or political complications. Dr. Kane finally broke the silence. "What do you need to prevent the failure?" "Access to the reactor compartment, detailed system schematics, and someone in authority willing to listen to a cook who claims to understand nuclear engineering better than the ship's certified technicians." "The first two I can probably manage. The third one might be more difficult." Elena nodded, understanding the challenge. "Dr. Kane, if I do this, if I reveal what I know and risk everything I've built over the last 10 years, I need to know that you'll support what I'm telling you, even when it contradicts everything the officers think they know about both the systems and about me." "Elena, I don't know who you were before you became the Svalbard's cook, but I know who you are now, and I trust that person to tell me the truth about what we're facing." Outside, the storm continued to build, and deep in the ship's belly, the reactor systems continued their increasingly erratic cycling. Time was running out, and the moment of decision was approaching faster than either woman was prepared to handle. By 2200 hours, the storm had transformed from weather into warfare. The Svalbard was locked in pack ice that groaned and shrieked as it compressed around the hull, while wind-driven snow reduced visibility to mere meters. The ship's motion had changed from rolling swells to the grinding, claustrophobic pressure of ice that wanted to crush them like an egg. In the communications bay, Ensign Al-Masri stared at displays that told an increasingly troubling story. The satellite uplink had failed 6 hours ago, not from equipment malfunction, but from atmospheric interference so severe that even hardened military systems couldn't penetrate it. Radio contact with NATO command had degraded to occasional static-filled fragments that provided no useful information exchange. "Still nothing from Severidovin's control," he reported to Lieutenant Commander Stanton, who was pacing the confined space with the agitation of someone accustomed to having solutions for every problem. "The storm is creating a communications blackout across the entire region." Stanton studied the weather displays with growing frustration. The storm system was larger and more persistent than forecast, and their current position placed them in the worst possible location for both weather protection and rescue accessibility. "How long before we can re-establish contact?" "Unknown, sir. This kind of interference pattern could last for days, depending on how the storm develops. We're essentially cut off until either we move out of the affected area or the weather clears."
The implications hung heavy in the confined space. NATO protocol required regular check-ins during classified operations, and extended communication blackouts triggered automatic rescue protocols. But rescue operations in these conditions were impossible, which meant the Svalbard and her crew were entirely dependent on their own resources until nature decided to cooperate. 3 decks below, Chief Ortega was discovering that nature had very little interest in cooperation. The backup reactor's cooling systems were displaying behavior patterns that made 22 years of engineering experience feel inadequate. Temperature spikes were occurring every 40 minutes with mathematical precision, followed by overcorrection cycles that pushed the coolant pumps beyond their design specifications. The technical manual spread across his workstation offered standard troubleshooting procedures for common failures, but nothing that addressed the specific combination of symptoms he was observing. The reactor was still operating within safety parameters, but those parameters were narrowing with each cycling event. "Petty Officer Sidorova," he called to the medical officer who was passing through the engineering section. "Do me a favor and log the current time and temperature readings. I want to document these fluctuations in case they become relevant later." Elena Sidorova paused in her rounds, her medical training making her sensitive to stress indicators that others might miss. Ortega's request had the careful precision of someone documenting evidence rather than routine maintenance. "Is there a specific concern I should be aware of?" "Probably nothing," Ortega lied, unwilling to spread alarm without more concrete evidence. "Just want to maintain detailed logs during the storm. Standard procedure." But Sidorova had grown up in Ukraine during the Chernobyl aftermath, and she recognized the particular kind of careful attention that people paid to reactor systems when something might be going wrong. "Chief, if there's any possibility of a radiation hazard, I need to know immediately. Medical preparation for exposure scenarios requires advanced planning." Ortega met her eyes directly, appreciating both her competence and her directness. "If I thought we were facing radiation exposure, you'd be the first person I'd notify. What we're dealing with now is mechanical stress that could lead to power loss, not containment failure. But I'll keep you informed if the situation changes." Sidorova nodded and continued her rounds, but made a mental note to review the ship's emergency medical protocols for reactor incidents. Her experience had taught her that problems with Soviet-era nuclear systems could escalate quickly and in ways that standard NATO training didn't always address. In the galley, Elena was preparing what might be the crew's last hot meal for several days if the power situation deteriorated further. But her attention was divided between cooking and the subtle vibration she could feel through the ship's structure, harmonic patterns that told a story the instruments couldn't capture. She'd spent the last 4 hours sketching from memory, reconstructing technical specifications for the reactor model that she'd helped design before her defection. The drawings were precise, detailed, and completely incriminating if anyone with the right background examined them. But they were the only documentation aboard that showed how the cooling system actually functioned under stress conditions. Midshipman D'Souza entered the galley with the kind of nervous energy that came from being young, competent, and aware that the adults around her were worried about things they weren't discussing. At 22, she possessed the dangerous combination of intelligence and insufficient experience to know when not to ask questions. Elena, I've been reviewing the ship's technical documentation for a watch duty assignment. I found some interesting historical information about our reactor system. Elena continued her food preparation, but her attention sharpened. Oh? According to the installation records, our backup reactor is a modified K-14 design, originally built for the Soviet submarine program in the 1980s. NATO acquired several units during the post-Cold War surplus sales and retrofitted them for surface vessel use. Elena's knife work remained steady, but Dr. Kane, who had been quietly reviewing her own data at the corner table, noticed the subtle change in Elena's posture that indicated intense focus. "That's interesting historical information," Elena said carefully. "What's really interesting is that the technical documentation is incomplete. Most of the detailed engineering specifications were never translated from Russian, so our maintenance procedures are based on NATO modifications rather than original design parameters." Rina pulled out her tablet and activated a document that made Elena's blood run cold, the original Russian technical manual for the K-14 reactor system, complete with design specifications that Elena personally authored 15 years ago. "I've been trying to translate some of the more complex sections, but my Russian isn't good enough for technical terminology. I was wondering—" She paused, studying Elena with the curiosity of someone who was beginning to connect patterns that didn't quite fit standard explanations. "I was wondering if you might be able to help with translation. Your Russian seems more comprehensive than you initially suggested." Dr. Kane looked up from her own tablet, recognizing the moment when casual curiosity was about to transform into something more significant. Elena stood frozen, her hands gripping the counter while she processed the implications of what Rina was suggesting. "Midshipman," Elena said slowly, "where did you find that manual?" "In the ship's digital archives. It was filed under historical documents, but I thought it might be useful for understanding why our reactor behaves differently than standard NATO systems." Rina activated another screen that showed the current power fluctuation data. "Especially since Chief Ortega mentioned that the cycling patterns match problems he's seen with Russian-built systems." Elena studied the data. Her professional knowledge immediately identified patterns that the ship's other technical personnel had missed. The cooling loop was experiencing pressure variations that indicated imminent failure of the primary circulation pump, a failure mode that would result in automatic reactor shutdown and total power loss within 12 hours. "Rina," she said quietly, "I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. The reactor system is not just experiencing stress from the storm, it's approaching a cascade failure that will leave us without power or heat in the middle of an Arctic blizzard. Can Chief Ortega prevent the failure? Not without understanding the specific engineering modifications that were made to adapt the system for surface vessel use. Those modifications created vulnerabilities that aren't documented in any NATO manual." Dr. Kane set down her tablet and gave Elena her full attention. "But you understand those vulnerabilities?" Elena looked at both women, weighing years of carefully maintained secrecy against the immediate threat to human lives. "Yes, I understand exactly why the system is failing and what needs to be done to prevent catastrophic power loss." Rina's eyes widened as the implications became clear. "Elena, how do you know?"
Because 15 years ago, I was Dr. Elena Mirova, senior engineer for the Soviet submarine program, and I personally designed the cooling system that's currently failing 3 decks below us. The silence in the galley was profound, broken only by the ship's groaning protests against the ice and the ominous humming of overtaxed machinery. Dr. Kane and Rena stared at Elena, processing not only her words, but their implications for everything they thought they knew about their quiet, competent cook. "You defected," Dr. Kane said, understanding flooding her voice. 10 years ago, during a joint Arctic research summit, I provided NATO with technical intelligence about Soviet submarine capabilities in exchange for asylum and protection. The condition of my protected status was that I would never work on military systems again. I would disappear into civilian life and use my knowledge only for survival, never for strategic advantage. Rena activated her tablet and pulled up personnel records that she probably shouldn't have had access to. Elena Mirov, civilian contractor, food services, hired 8 months ago. Previous employment with various shipping companies, all documented and verified. All carefully constructed fiction, Elena confirmed, paid for by NATO intelligence services to ensure that Dr. Elena Mirova stayed dead while Elena Mirov could live quietly and safely. Dr. Kane leaned forward, her scientific mind processing the ramifications. But if you're the original system designer, you can prevent the failure. Yes, but doing so would require accessing restricted areas of the ship, overriding safety protocols that I'm not authorized to touch, and revealing technical knowledge that would immediately compromise my protected status. If NATO command learns that I've violated the conditions of my asylum— Elena, Rena interrupted with the directness of youth, if we lose power in these conditions, we'll all be dead long before NATO command has a chance to review your asylum status. Before Elena could respond, the ship's lighting flickered again, this time accompanied by a subtle change in the ventilation system that indicated the reactor's power output was becoming increasingly unstable. The 3 women looked at each other, understanding that the conversation had moved beyond theoretical concerns into immediate crisis management. Dr. Kane activated her scientific access codes and pulled up real-time engineering data that painted an increasingly desperate picture. The power fluctuations are accelerating. Based on the trend analysis, we have maybe 18 hours before complete system failure. Elena studied the data with the trained eye of someone who understood exactly what she was seeing. 12 hours, she corrected. The circulation pump will fail when the pressure differentials reach critical levels, and that will happen sooner than your trend analysis suggests. Can you prevent it? Elena looked at the technical specifications displayed on Rena's tablet, then at the real-time data on Dr. Kane's screen. After a long moment, she nodded slowly. I can prevent it, but I'll need access to the reactor compartment, and I'll need someone in authority to authorize modifications that will seem completely unjustified unless they understand the system's actual design parameters. What about Chief Ortega? He's already worried about the system behavior. Ortega understands that something is wrong, but he doesn't have the authority to authorize the modifications I need to make. That would require either Commander Stanton or Captain Volkov, and neither of them is likely to listen to technical advice from the ship's cook. Dr. Kane stood and gathered her equipment. Then we need to convince them to listen, and we need to do it quickly before the situation deteriorates beyond any possibility of correction. Elena nodded, understanding that the quiet life she'd built over the last 10 years was about to end. Dr. Kane, Rena, if we're going to do this, we need to move quickly. Once the circulation pump fails, not even I can prevent complete power loss. The 3 women gathered Elena's sketches and the technical data,
preparing to challenge a command structure that wasn't prepared to accept technical expertise from someone whose credentials were classified beyond their access level. The bridge felt smaller with the weight of Elena's revelation hanging in the air like an unexploded ordnance. Captain Volkov stood behind his command station, studying the technical drawings Elena had spread across the navigation table, sketches that showed intimate knowledge of systems he assumed were safely documented in NATO manuals. These specifications, Volkov began, then stopped, processing implications that extended far beyond engineering concerns. As a half-Norwegian, half-Russian officer, he understood the delicate politics of Cold War defections better than most. If you're who you claim to be, Dr. Mirova, your presence on this vessel represents a massive security breach.
Elena kept her voice steady, despite the tremor of fear that accompanied stepping back into her former identity. Captain, my asylum status was arranged at levels above both our clearances. What matters now is that the reactor cooling system will fail catastrophically within 6 hours unless specific modifications are made to compensate for dynamic ice pressure loads. Lieutenant Commander Stanton paced behind them, his career-long adherence to protocol warring with the evidence before his eyes. This is completely unacceptable. We're being asked to trust critical ship systems to someone whose credentials we can't verify, based on alleged expertise from a hostile nation. Dr. Kane stepped forward, her scientific training making her focus on verifiable facts rather than political complications. Commander, I've spent the last 4 hours cross-referencing Elena's technical drawings with our system readouts. Her predictions about failure modes have been accurate to within minutes. The cooling loop pressure differentials are following exactly the pattern she described. Elena pointed to specific components in her sketches, her finger tracing cooling circuits that existed nowhere in the ship's official documentation. The NATO modifications added redundant safety systems, but they created resonance feedback loops under specific stress conditions. When the ship is locked in ice and experiencing constant pressure variations, those safety systems actually accelerate pump failure. Volkov examined the drawings more closely, recognizing the kind of technical precision that couldn't be fabricated, but his expression remained deeply troubled. Dr. Mirova, even assuming your identity and expertise are legitimate, authorizing you to modify critical reactor systems would violate multiple international agreements. My career, my command, possibly my freedom. Captain, Elena interrupted quietly, in 4 hours your career concerns will be irrelevant because we'll all be dead. The reactor isn't just experiencing mechanical stress, it's approaching a cascade failure that will result in complete power loss during an Arctic storm with no possibility of rescue. The bridge fell silent except for the constant groaning of ice against the hull and the increasingly irregular humming of overtaxed electrical systems. Through the bridge windows, the storm showed no signs of abating, and the ice pressure readings continued their relentless climb. Ensign Al-Masri looked up from his communication station with the nervous energy of someone who possessed crucial information but lacked the authority to act on it. Captain, I've been monitoring power grid stability. The fluctuation patterns are accelerating. Based on current trends, we'll lose primary electrical systems within the next watch period. Stanton turned to face Elena directly, his skepticism beginning to crack under the weight of mounting evidence. If, and I emphasize if, we allow you to attempt these modifications, what guarantees do we have that you won't compromise other ship systems? Elena met his gaze steadily. Commander, the only guarantee I can offer is that without modifications, the reactor will fail completely. With modifications, we have a reasonable chance of survival. Those are the only options available to us. Captain Volkov studied the storm data, the reactor readings, and Elena's technical drawings, understanding that command meant making impossible decisions with incomplete information. After a long moment, he nodded slowly. Dr. Mirova, you'll work under Chief Ortega's direct supervision. Any modifications must be approved by him and documented completely. Commander Stanton will oversee the operation to ensure security protocols are maintained. He paused, meeting Elena's eyes directly. And God help us all if you're wrong about this. The reactor alarms began their electronic shriek at 0347 hours, cutting through the storm's howl with mechanical urgency that brought Chief Ortega running through darkened corridors toward the engineering section. Emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red shadows, and the ship's motion had taken on the grinding, irregular rhythm of a vessel locked in ice that wanted to crush it. Elena found Ortega in the reactor monitoring station, staring at readouts that told a story his 22 years of experience had never prepared him for. Coolant pressure was dropping toward critical levels, and the circulation pump was cycling erratically, fighting against conditions that exceeded all design parameters. "Chief," Elena said, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who understood exactly what was happening. "You need to shut down the automated safety protocols immediately. They're making the situation exponentially worse." Ortega looked up from the displays, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold air cycling through the compartment. "Elena, I can't authorize that without direct orders from the bridge, and you're not cleared to—" "Lewis," Elena used his first name for the first time in their acquaintance. "Look at the pressure differential readings. The automated system is trying to compensate for a failure mode it was never designed to handle. Every correction cycle is pushing the circulation pump closer to complete mechanical failure." Ortega studied her face, seeing something that hadn't been visible during their previous interactions. Absolute confidence, technical authority, the unmistakable presence of someone who possessed intimate knowledge of the systems they were discussing. "You really designed this reactor configuration?" "I designed the original cooling system for submarine operations, where external pressure loads are constant and predictable. When NATO modified the design for surface vessel use, they didn't account for the dynamic stress patterns created by variable ice pressure and storm-induced motion. The pump is literally fighting itself."
Another alarm joined the first, this one indicating that secondary cooling loops were approaching temperature limits that would trigger automatic reactor shutdown. But as Elena had explained, shutdown under current conditions would likely result in pump failure and complete power loss. Ortega made his decision with the pragmatic certainty of someone who'd learned to trust competence over credentials. He handed Elena his access card and activated the manual override controls. "Show me what needs to be done." Elena moved to the reactor control panel with fluid efficiency, her hands finding switches and controls that most operators never needed to touch. "I'm bypassing the pressure regulation circuits and routing coolant flow through the emergency backup loop. This will reduce pump stress and allow manual pressure control." Her fingers moved across the controls with muscle memory that spoke of years spent working with these exact systems. Slowly, the most urgent alarms began to quiet as coolant flow stabilized and pump cycling returned to manageable parameters. "Temperature holding steady," Ortega reported, relief evident in his voice. "Pressure differential stabilizing. Whatever you're going, it's working." Elena made final adjustments to the flow controls, then stepped back from the panel. "This is a temporary stabilization, Chief. The underlying stress factors haven't changed, and the modified cooling configuration can't handle full operational loads indefinitely. We have perhaps 12 hours before more permanent repairs become necessary." Ortega nodded, understanding that they'd bought time rather than solve the fundamental problem. "What kind of permanent repairs?" "Complete recalibration of the pressure regulation system, replacement of the primary circulation pump, and modification of the safety protocols to account for surface vessel stress patterns. The kind of work that requires dry dock facilities and specialized technical documentation." Documentation that doesn't exist in any NATO manual. Elena's expression grew somber as she contemplated the implications. "Documentation that exists only in my memory and in Russian technical archives that NATO has never had access to." By 0800 hours, the temporary stabilization was beginning to show signs of strain. Captain Volkov, under pressure from both the deteriorating situation and protocols he couldn't ignore, made the decision that Elena had been dreading since revealing her identity. "Dr. Mirova," he announced over the ship's intercom. "You're confined to quarters pending resolution of the current emergency. All personnel are directed to maintain standard operating procedures without civilian interference." Elena didn't resist the escort to her small cabin, understanding that Volkov was attempting to balance immediate survival needs with longer-term political consequences. But she also understood that without her direct intervention, the temporary cooling modifications would fail within hours. She was reviewing technical calculations when Rena burst through her door, breathing hard from running through corridors that were growing colder as the ship's heating system struggled with reduced power availability. Rena, Elena, they tried to initiate standard shutdown procedures. Chief Ortega refused to authorize it because he said the shutdown sequence would trigger pump failure. Commander Stanton overrode him and ordered the shutdown anyway. Elena stood immediately, her face growing pale. Did the shutdown succeed? No, the safety systems locked out the shutdown sequence when coolant pressure dropped below minimum thresholds. But the attempt sent massive power surges through the electrical grid. We've lost half the emergency lighting and most of the heating systems. Elena moved to her porthole, studying the storm that showed no signs of abating. Ice continued to accumulate against the ship's superstructure, and visibility remained near zero. Without power for heating and lighting, the Svalbard would become uninhabitable within hours. "Elena," she said quietly, "I need you to understand something. If I leave this cabin and return to the reactor compartment, my life as Elena Mirova ends permanently. NATO intelligence will either want to exploit my knowledge or eliminate me as a security risk. There's no middle ground for people with my background." Rena studied her face, seeing not just the cook who had become a mentor figure, but the brilliant engineer who had sacrificed everything to save lives. "Elena, every person on this ship will testify that you acted to save us. We'll protect you." Elena smiled sadly, understanding the young woman's optimism, but recognizing realities that Rena hadn't yet learned to see. Midshipmen, good intentions don't always translate into protection when classified information and international politics are involved. Then what do we do? Elena looked at the technical drawings spread across her small desk, then at Rena's earnest face. "We save 23 lives and deal with the consequences afterward, because that's what competent people do when incompetent systems fail." Ortega met them at the sealed reactor compartment, his weathered face showing the strain of maintaining systems he didn't fully understand while watching his ship slowly die around him. Emergency lighting cast harsh shadows across equipment that hummed with increasing desperation.
"I'm opening this door against direct orders," he told Elena, his hand hesitating over the access controls. "If you're wrong about this, we're all facing court-martial proceedings." "Luis," Elena replied, pulling on protective equipment, "if I'm wrong about this, court-martial will be the least of our concerns." The reactor compartment felt like the beating heart of a dying organism, filled with the sounds of overtaxed machinery and rising temperatures that spoke of systems approaching their absolute limits. Elena entered the space and immediately took command, moving toward manual controls with the fluid expertise of someone returning to familiar territory. "Shut down all automatic pressure regulation," she called to Ortega, her hands already working across control panels that most operators never needed to access. "I'm rerouting primary coolant flow through the auxiliary circulation system." Her movements were precise, economical, guided by 15 years of experience with these exact systems under the most demanding conditions imaginable. She bypassed safety interlocks that had been installed during NATO modifications, accessing original Soviet control circuits that still functioned according to her original control specifications. Captain Volkov appeared in the compartment doorway, drawn by reports of unauthorized access and the sound of systems that were finally beginning to stabilize. He stood silent, watching Elena work with precision that left no doubt about her expertise or her authority in this environment. "Temperature dropping," Ortega reported, his voice filled with relief and amazement.
coolant pressure stabilizing across all circuits, primary circulation pump operating within normal parameters for the first time in 18 hours. Elena made final adjustments to flow rates and pressure settings, then stepped back as the reactor settled into stable operation that felt like a miracle after days of escalating crisis. The current configuration will maintain stable operation for approximately 48 hours. After that, you'll need replacement components and complete technical documentation. Dr. Kane appeared behind the captain, her scientific instruments confirming what everyone could hear. The reactor was operating normally for the first time since the storm began. Elena, the power grid is stabilizing. Heating systems are coming back online throughout the ship. Elena nodded, understanding that she'd accomplished the immediate goal of preventing catastrophic failure. But she also understood that her actions had irrevocably changed her status and her future. The temporary fixes will hold long enough to reach port and arrange for proper repairs. Captain Volkov stepped into the compartment, studying Elena with new respect and considerable apprehension about the political complications her expertise represented. Dr. Mirova, you've saved this ship and everyone aboard her, but you've also created a situation that extends far beyond my authority to resolve. Elena began securing the control systems, her movement still efficient despite the exhaustion that was beginning to set in. Captain, I understand the complications. I've been living with them for 10 years. What matters now is that your crew survives to face whatever consequences follow. Communications with NATO command were re-established 36 hours later as the storm finally began to dissipate and the Svalbard worked free from the ice that had held her captive. Captain Volkov faced the impossible task of reporting an incident that involved classified systems, undocumented technical procedures, and a defector whose very existence represented potential political embarrassment. His solution was careful documentation that emphasized results while minimizing details that might compromise Elena's protected status. The official incident report stated that civilian contractor Elena Mirov had provided valuable technical assistance during a reactor emergency, drawing on unspecified previous experience with similar systems. Your background remains classified above my access level, Volkov explained to Elena in his private cabin where they could speak without generating additional documentation. NATO intelligence services will handle your case directly, but I've recommended that your actions be recognized as heroic rather than problematic. Dr. Kane had submitted her own report, a detailed scientific analysis that praised Elena's technical expertise while carefully avoiding specific references to her previous identity. I've described your contributions as essential to crew survival, and I've recommended that future missions include provisions for consulting with personnel who possess specialized knowledge regardless of their official job descriptions. Commander Stanton approached the conversation with obvious difficulty, his career-long adherence to military hierarchy conflicting with his recognition of Elena's life-saving competence. Dr. Mirov, I owe you an apology. I let protocol concerns override practical necessities, and my actions nearly resulted in catastrophic consequences. Elena studied his face, seeing genuine remorse and perhaps the beginning of wisdom that came from recognizing the limitations of rigid thinking. Commander, you were following established procedures designed to maintain security and discipline. Those procedures work well under normal circumstances. This situation was anything but normal. How do we prevent similar problems in the future? Elena considered the question carefully, understanding that her answer might influence policies that affected countless future operations. Create systems that recognize expertise regardless of its source. Competence doesn't always wear the uniform or carry the credentials you expect. Sometimes the person who can save your life is the one you never thought to consult. As the Svalbard limped toward a nearest port for emergency repairs, Elena prepared for an uncertain future while experiencing something she hadn't felt in years: acceptance by a community that valued her contributions. The crew's response was immediate and unanimous, expressed through small gestures that spoke louder than formal recognition.
Rena left a carefully wrapped package in Elena's quarters, her original Russian engineering textbooks, somehow located and acquired through channels she never explained, but which Lena suspected involved considerable personal effort and expense. The gesture represented not just gratitude, but understanding of who Lena really was beneath her carefully constructed civilian identity. Chief Ortega spent his off-duty hours fixing the perpetually broken ventilation fan in the galley, a minor irritation that Lena had mentioned once during their technical discussions. The repair was perfect, professional, and completely unnecessary from an operational standpoint, which made it profoundly meaningful as an expression of respect. Dr. Kane included Lena in her scientific reports as a consulting engineer, a designation that required considerable bureaucratic creativity, but which ensured that Lena's contributions would be part of the official record. Your expertise deserves recognition, even if that recognition has to be carefully managed. Commander Stanton found Lena on deck as they approached port, the morning sun finally breaking through clouds that had seemed permanent during their ordeal. Without speaking, he offered a crisp military salute, not to the cook, but to the engineer who had saved them all. "Thank you," he said simply, the words carrying weight that formal commendations could never match. Lena returned the salute with quiet dignity. "Take care of each other, Commander. That's what competent crews do." Ensign Al-Masri presented Lena with a complete set of translated technical manuals for the ship's reactor systems, documentation he'd prepared during the long hours of their journey to port. "These should help whoever maintains the system after you're gone," he said shyly. "I thought you should know that your knowledge won't be lost." Lena accepted the manuals with deep gratitude, understanding that Al-Masri had created something that might prevent future crews from facing similar crises. These documents represent exactly the kind of institutional learning that saves lives, Ensign. Well done. 8 months later, Lena worked in a small coastal cafe overlooking the Norwegian Sea, her hands still moving with the precision of someone accustomed to critical systems, but now applied to creating perfect espresso and elegant pastries. NATO had offered her choices: return to classified engineering work with full protection and recognition, or continue her civilian life with enhanced identity protection and occasional consulting opportunities. She had chosen peace, but not anonymity. Her new identity included acknowledged expertise that allowed her to contribute technical knowledge when needed, while maintaining the quiet life she preferred. Aboard the Svalbard, now equipped with proper technical documentation and upgraded reactor systems, Midshipman D'Souza had been promoted to lieutenant and conducted orientation briefings for new crew members using procedures that included civilian expertise evaluation as standard protocol. Her presentations emphasized the importance of recognizing competence, regardless of its source or official designation. Chief Ortega taught advanced engineering workshops throughout the NATO fleet, sessions that consistently emphasized practical knowledge over formal credentials and encouraged personnel to value expertise wherever they encountered it. His reputation as an innovative problem solver had led to promotion opportunities that he accepted with quiet satisfaction. Dr. Kane's research publications consistently advocated for diverse technical perspectives in crisis management, and her recommendations had influenced NATO policies regarding the utilization of specialized knowledge during emergency situations. Her work had contributed to regulatory changes that might prevent future incidents similar to their Arctic ordeal. Commander Stanton had developed a service-wide reputation for leadership that balanced protocol adherence with practical flexibility. His approach to command emphasized listening to unconventional solutions and creating environments where expertise could emerge from unexpected sources. In her final log entry from their Arctic voyage, Lieutenant D'Souza had written,
Today, I learned that competence doesn't always wear the uniform you expect, and that sometimes the person who saves your life is the one you never thought to ask for help. Lena taught me that true expertise works quietly, waiting for the moment when silence becomes more dangerous than truth. The best leaders create space for that expertise to emerge, regardless of where it originates. Lena never saw the log entry, but she would have approved of its message. In her cafe by the sea, she occasionally received visitors from NATO vessels, former crew members who stopped by to share coffee and conversation with the woman who had taught them that wisdom often comes disguised as ordinary competence, waiting for the moment when ordinary procedures aren't sufficient to preserve human lives. The most important engineering she had learned was often the kind that built bridges between people, creating systems strong enough to survive any storm.
Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.